It's not just about changing the conversation. It's about changing the goal of the conversation. It's not just about trying to be right or trying to prove somebody wrong, but it's about seeking to understand, seeking to learn, and seeking to grow. And when that's the objective of our conversation, that's when everybody starts to win.
If you don't understand, don't misunderstand. And a lot of people, when they don't understand, they already draw their conclusion or make assumptions that their perception of what they understood is the reality. If we're not trying to be right or trying to make somebody else wrong, but we're seeking clarity, that's where the bridge can actually be crossed.
All right, welcome back to another episode of It's Not So Black and White. I'm flying solo again tonight. All of my co-hosts have fled in fear. No, I'm just kidding. They all have various family commitments that prevent them from being here tonight, but my little fella's already in bed, tucked away, sleeping. So that means that I get to have this enjoyable conversation with Dr. Robert Yoho. And just a little bit of backstory. He's a healthcare whistleblower, so that already makes it this an interesting conversation. He also published 2 books recently about medical corruption, Butchered by Healthcare and Hormone Secrets. He had a surgical practice in the United States until his retirement three years ago, and so I expect this to be quite an interesting and enlightening conversation. So I guess my first question for you now, do I call you Robert, or do I call you Dr. Robert, or what do you prefer?
We're colleagues in this setting. Just call me Robert and I'll call you John. Thank you.
That sounds good. So my first question for you then is, you spent over 30 years within the healthcare industry, within the medical industry. And so someone might ask, okay, why did you wait 30 years to sort of be a whistleblower, when you're now retired? Or what prompted you to take that sort of extraordinary step?
John, I'm like Rip Van Winkle. So I was asleep for my entire career, and I learned about healthcare corruption through the lens of hormone therapy. And I eventually wrote a book about it, and I found out that these drugs were being, can you see this?
Yeah, you bet. There we are.
Very cool. That's my hormone book. And This image on the front is an image of a Mexican mask. And as you can see, the names of the hormones are superimposed on that. And that's supposed to be your brain on hormones. It's that important. But I started prescribing hormones to menopausal women, and it was mainly women because I was a cosmetic surgeon. And the people were coming to me to try to relieve their hormone symptoms, and they wanted surgery. And most of the plastic surgeons just go ahead and operate on them. And, sometimes it might even work, but it's not a treatment for their problem, which is usually declining hormones at the age of 50. And so I got interested in this. And as I studied it and learned more, I found out that the FDA had put these black box warnings on hormones. And we had used these things for 50, 70, 100 years. Thyroid, 120 years we've had experience with this drug. Estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, 50, 60, 70 years of clinical experience. And so they were some of the very finest drugs we've ever had. They're almost completely safe. And yet they were warning of strokes and heart disease and cancer. And so I couldn't figure it out for a while until I gradually got into it more and more. And I found out that the FDA is completely a creature of big pharma, and they were protecting drugs that had patents on them. And because the bioidentical hormones can't be patented because they're natural human components, they were running these things down because they would eliminate the need for a lot of other medications like cholesterol medications, and it would help heart disease. So they fabricated all this nonsense, and that's what kind of got me started. And then after I kind of woke up a little bit, like shook myself awake, I looked around me and I just got obsessed with all the corruption in medicine. And gradually, go ahead.
Yeah. So you mentioned getting obsessed with the corruption in medicine. Is this while you had your practice, while you're still, I guess, on the inside, so to speak, you decided, I want to maybe take a look around while I still have this place on the inside and see what's really going on here. And if so, what were you looking for? What were some things or indicators that maybe something wasn't quite right here?
Well, good question. And the answer is yes, it was. I retired when I was 65. That's the average age of retirement for physicians. And we have a difficult time in California with cosmetic surgery. There are lawsuits and this and that. And of course, you're never entirely blameless in these sorts of things. But I had some problems at the end of my career that made it made it more easy for me to quit than to continue practicing. And I could have continued, but it just is hardly worth it. And so I got into this thing and started looking at one field after the other. I mean, I looked at insurance companies. I looked at which take 20% off the top of the entire $4 trillion U.S. medical budget. It's crazy. It's not like that in any other country. It's not like that in Canada, is it?
No, that seems absurd.
It's
20%.
Absurd. They manage Medicare and they manage all the programs, all the private programs. It's just insane. And they are arguably incentivized to make things more expensive because they're like the house in a casino. They take the money off the top. And then I learned about hospitals who take at least a third, maybe 40% of the total thing. And they are ruthless predators. And they're, as we found out in the world of today, where we have a new disease, they've been incentivized to cause all kinds of problems. We can get into that later. And I studied, I studied psychiatry, which I view as the most corrupt specialty. I studied oncology or cancer therapy. I studied the big pharmaceutical companies, which I don't know whether you knew this, but they're the most corrupt industry in history as measured by their settlements with federal prosecutors, right?
Right, just in terms of the billions of dollars of fines they've had to pay out.
86 billion in judgments and settlements to civil plaintiffs and U.S. federal prosecutors since 2000. Thousands of criminal records. And there are three of them that have over $2 billion each in single settlements. It's unbelievable. And we have an anti-inflammatory extra that caused 50,000 deaths, and the well-known company that sponsored it or invented it or promoted it, they knew it was going to happen ahead of time. They rolled out the drug anyway, and the whole thing was profitable despite the settlement. I mean, it's just insane.
So this leads to kind of an interesting question here, because you're shining a light on something. It seems like it should be very obvious. You say, okay, because now these billions of dollars in settlements, these are probably only the settlements that were for something so egregious that it generated enough public outrage that it incentivized politicians to act because it was this bad. There must be a lot of things that are probably not making it into the public eye because there just isn't enough financial incentive, or there isn't maybe enough harm that's being caused to push people to speak out enough, or they're just getting sort of shushed.
I don't think those settlements count individual civil settlements, right? For example, Prozac caused violence and suicide in a consequential number of the people who take it. And this was known from the beginning by the company before they rolled out the drug. This is material that's that was available in discovery in a lawsuit. And this, this bunch of criminals, they just allowed it to happen, let all these people die. And they have settled hundreds of millions of dollars of individual cases. And of course, there's gag clauses on all this. Now, your listeners should go to Wikipedia, which is an unreliable source for the most part, but they have been unable to purge Big Pharma's criminal settlement page. And all you have to do is search for Big Pharma Wikipedia criminal settlements. And you'll see that the top 20 companies, 22 drug makers, they've got their own page of shame. And it's a really remarkable thing to see if you've never seen this.
So it's hard to purge that because it's actual factual on record, and if Wikipedia is supposed to be an unbiased, well cited, reputable source of information, or at least
what a joke that is.
They're apparently attempting to be that, but
no, they are not. They are exceedingly woke, and they are exceedingly biased towards their paymasters. Mm-hmm. These entities are all owned by a few huge corporations. There's $25 trillion worth of assets owned by BlackRock and Vanguard alone. And BlackRock owns, and those two corporations own pieces of each other. So that's a monolithic financial entity. And BlackRock owns majority stakes in Pfizer and Moderna.
So then, anyone who's used Wikipedia at some point in time has seen the plea for funding dollars. Why are they holding their hands out for funding dollars if they're getting money from like serious backers who have a lot of money? They're asking, hey, would you donate $2 a month or something like that? Like why are they holding their hands out?
I don't know. don't know.
I guess you don't have an
too
inside
deep
track.
into the conspiracy rabbit hole for me, but they are an organ of the insane wall of propaganda that we're facing now, and as is the federal government, as is the news media, and these things are all owned by these large entities.
Now, you mentioned that in your opinion, and I think it's a qualified professional opinion because of your experience within the industry, that you felt like psychiatry was one of the most corrupt branches of medicine. And to distinguish between psychiatry and psychology, psychiatry is a medical practice where the prescription of medications is allowed, whereas a psychologist is a professional who is not allowed to prescribe medications. Is that correct?
That's correct. Now, not everyone would agree with me about psychiatry because there are plenty of corrupt competitors for that top spot, like oncology. But the psychiatrists, according to Robert Whitaker, who wrote kind of a definitive book about it that was widely read, and incidentally, my material is none of it's original. It's all derivative. I've got 500 references in each book. And so anyway, psychiatry went into this medication model of disease through some economic forces. And what happened was they started putting out this DSM book, right, that defined their entities. And Whitaker demonstrated that very few, if any, of the psychiatric drugs have sugar pill control studies, that double-blind control studies. And apparently the reason is we've got 20% of the population already on psych drugs. And I mean, it's just crazy. We have 50 to 70% of the whole population on prescription drugs of one kind or another. But these psych drugs have never been properly studied. And it turns out they deny this, but they're tremendously addictive. If you know anybody that's been on Prozac for 3 years and got off of it, you're looking at a miracle, because the SSRIs are exceedingly difficult to quit. They alter the brain chemistry somehow. So you have waves of anxiety and depression if you try to quit this. You
go through such extreme psychological misery that it's just, you would rather just be on that medication than go through the extremely torturous withdrawal that you might experience.
They don't have withdrawals like opioids with sweating and diarrhea and all that stuff, but those things go away in 2 days. For the psych drugs, they last long periods of time, and they can use tapering doses, and it still doesn't work. So the standards were established by these doctors, paid for by the psych drug corporations, and written up in that DSM, and then it becomes medical standards. And then the doctors have to do it, or they can get sanctioned by the medical boards. I mean, it's an insane system.
And for those who would be unfamiliar, like the DSM is
Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's a book, a yellow book that goes through various iterations, and it changes and morphs and metastasizes through votes of this American Psychological or Psychiatric Association.
Right, and this is referencing all the variety of diagnoses, sort of psychological diagnoses.
All the made-up things like oppositional defiance disorder, which is another code word for young boy. It's the same. Yeah. So you may know this, John. Not everybody does, but before the age of the psych drugs, all of these psychiatric entities were thought to wax and wane. They got better and got worse. And if you were crazy, you weren't crazy all the time. But since the drugs were started, these things have become chronic. And if you go off the drugs, you experience this horrible withdrawal, which mimics the original disease. So the observers of this scene have thought that the increase in disability and welfare programs that we've seen exactly maps into the psychiatric drug era, right? In other words, it's probably caused by the drugs themselves, because once you get on this stuff, you can't get off. You're stuck.
So, which might beg the question, and of course, we're just having conversation here. When I ask these questions, I don't expect that you necessarily have the omnipotent answers. But of course, you want to explore how you come to these conclusions. Why is it you think that? Because I wish I could find the source, but I believe I found a statistic that said something along the lines of anxiety levels seen in young people, and I think by young people they might be like under 30 or under 25, something like that, but now, presently, what is being experienced by young people in terms of sort of some kind of mental health issue are on par with what was seen in psych ward patients back in the 1950s. So it seems like there's this population-wide like wave of potential psychiatric disorders. Now, does this, in your opinion or your observation, is this like genuine, like there's a lot of sort of mental health distress that's gripping the population, or and if so, what would be leading to it? Or is it a case of there's a lot of things that are maybe just should be considered a part of the normal human condition, where we we go through difficult mental and emotional experiences and sort of mental health waxes and wanes? Or how do you see us getting to this place where we have such a large portion of our population seemingly experiencing all of these psychiatric disorders?
Great question. Before I answer the question, I forgot to do my disclaimer at the start. This is not medical care. Sorry about this. I got to do this because of the lawyers. This is not medical care. Use this information at your own risk. If you have a problem, you have to see a licensed provider. So the answer to your question is, I obviously I can't give you a definitive answer, but I can give you some clues, right? You guys, Blue's Clues. Have you ever heard of that? That's a kids TV show.
Okay.
So here's a few Blue's Clues. The first Blue's Clue is, I thought the answer was that it was entirely marketing until fairly recently. In other words, the modus or the modus of this industry is to virtually invent a disease, invent a cure, and then scare the living hell out of everyone until everyone goes to their doctor and asks for the medication. And in America and New Zealand, they're the only two places where we allow direct-to-consumer drug advertising.
Right.
And so here they bludgeon us all until, okay. So I've been asked that question several times, and my initial answers a year and a half or 2 years ago was I believe that it was entirely marketing based. But I've gotten a little more sophisticated, and I realized that, for example, the autism rates are now something like 1 in 40 of these little kids. And this is headbanging, completely useless kids that can't operate, they can't do anything. And the autism rates prior to the last 20 years were very, very low. And in fact, 30 or 40 years ago, it was considered to be vanishingly low. I mean, 1 in 10,000 or some crazy thing. When I was a kid, we never heard of an autistic kid. But now it's common. And so there have been various theories developed about why this is the case. And of course, autism is long ways from anxiety, which I'll address in a second. But one of the theories has been that the toxicity of the vaccines has caused autism and caused a lot of other problems. And there's some relatively good evidence that suggests that's true. I mean, the thimerosal, which is a mercury compound, thimerosal is an adjuvant. In other words, it makes the vaccine work a little better. It hops it up somehow.
Right.
And the mercury is intensely toxic. It sequesters in the brain. And the theories have been that this has been the culprit, but nobody knows for sure. Establishing causality is a big job. And
I would say it's maybe a near impossibility, actually.
There, in this case, maybe, but I think there's a lot of evidence that since the beginning of the vaccine era, since we made it impossible to sue the vaccine manufacturers, the number of vaccines went up from 4 or 5 to 75 individual shots, which is the current standard, right? And this is quite a lot of economic activity in the pediatrician's office. And I'm not saying that they're not sincere about what they're doing. I'm just saying it on the face of it, it's crazy. We're treating diseases, we're attempting to prophylax or prevent diseases that are inconsequential, like the flu. And the flu vaccine is completely worthless. I mean, it doesn't do a thing. And you can go to Cochrane Reviews and learn about that a bit more if you're interested.
Yeah. So we're venturing into, and I don't mind doing so in this conversation, but we're venturing into territory, of course, that there are people out there that are listening that are going to go maybe suggest that venturing into this territory might be in some way discrediting to you as a medical professional, because the stance that you hold around these issues is largely contrary to maybe what's held by sort of mainstream institutions to be true. And how do how do you find yourself kind of navigating? Because I have no doubt that when you start to go into these conversations, you mention some of these names that you've mentioned, that this in some way, shape, or form sort of raises the hackles in some people, and they go, well, hang on a sec, is this guy credible? He's listed these particular names here who I mean, a lot of people have tried to discredit, and a lot of sort of mainstream practitioners would say go against the views that they hold. How do you sort of navigate getting into this territory and not getting lost, I guess?
Well, it's hard to get lost if you're looking for the truth. It's not hard to get lost if you listen to mainstream media, which is 75% supported by pharma, right? The Oscars were sponsored by Pfizer. 100%, virtually 100% of the news is sponsored by pharma. So when you get into terms like fact checking, debunked, quackery, domestic terrorist, I think your listeners are, at least your bright listeners, are immediately smell a rat when they hear any of these things. And your idea that I'm less credible because I'm not listening to what they say on CNN, I mean, it's laughable, John. I mean, it's just laughable.
Is there so then? Is there maybe a feeling within? Because I imagine there's just a lot of well-intentioned, well-meaning medical professionals within the sort of the behemoth that is the U.S. medical industry who believe they are doing good things and doing good work and sincerely believe in what they do and the treatments they provide and so on. Is there maybe an element of this that's like, if we were to, let's say, acknowledge the truth that you are presenting, that for a lot of people, this would create a tremendous degree of cognitive dissonance, maybe even beyond their capacity to really reconcile?
Well, that's a really kind way to put it. I mean, it's a kind way to put it. But here's something no one can deny, right? We have lost our First Amendment rights, right? We are censored on these private platforms that represent the vast majority of our communications. And if anybody understands anything about American law, and as a Canadian, you should understand this because your Constitution lacks a lot of it. It is based on the First Amendment, which is the right to communicate freely. And if anybody thinks that listening to propaganda is the way to achieve any kind of knowledge, especially medical knowledge, it's just a joke. I mean, we've got the New England Journal of Medicine. I call it the formerly most well-regarded or medical journal in the world out of the even it was more well-regarded than the rest of the big five. And they just published 2 months ago, they published an article claiming that one of the very best drugs against the most egregious disease that we're all focused on, they claimed it didn't work, right? But they played the usual big pharma trick. They used the wrong dose. They used doses that were too small for only 3 days. So it made a mockery out of them. And they, in certain platforms, it made them a laughingstock. The same thing happened with Lancet. Last year, they did a similar thing with another drug that's the second best drug against this disease. And they were basically, within 2 weeks, someone called out the whole thing as complete nonsense. And so, look, you ask why doctors, are doctors sincere, and how can doctors be so fooled? I think in this instance, doctors are an exceedingly elite group. I mean, they've got an average IQ of 130. They're the largest smart group in America, but they've been so beaten up by their training, and their training is to follow precedent, and they're afraid of litigation. They're afraid they're going to lose their profession. And so there's a old adage by Sinclair Lewis, and that I'm going to butcher it, but it's something to the effect that when your income is involved, it's impossible to see things for the way they are. And that's the case with the doctors. And look, I don't doubt their feelings of idealism, but I'm almost completely contemptuous of them, with a few exceptions. I mean, we have probably less than 10% that are speaking out now. And we have people like John Campbell, who they're like Winnie the Pooh. They went around the circle 3 or 4 times before they figured it out. They were heavy proponents of this treatment for this disease, and he red pilled completely when the drug company was forced under, pain of legal to put out their documents. And now we've got 5 or 10% of their documents, and it's obvious these people are murderers. I mean, they're just, it's insane what we've been through and what we're going through with this medication.
Yeah, and I think for those who are listening, it's important to understand that because this is also broadcast live on certain public platforms, we have to be selective about the language we use in order to enable us to have this conversation, ideally free of censorship. And so, but again, this is you said something that I want to circle back to, and that is that because there, I absolutely am fascinated by sort of psychology, by beliefs, by how we form our levels of understanding around specific topics. When income is at stake, it's hard to see clearly. And there's something about sort of maybe a primal threat mechanism in our brain that when we feel like our livelihood is at stake, like, for example, I have to choose carefully what language I might use on the various social media platforms to discuss certain topics, because my business is an online business that relies on, to some degree, my ability to be present on these platforms, meaning that should I choose to adopt a more controversial stance and begin publicly speaking about it, there's a high degree of likelihood that my presence could be removed from these public domains and thus harming my business. And so in a sense, I'm self-censoring some of the things that I might hold, and I'm not able to bring them to discussion and have them held up to scrutiny because I'm concerned that should I speak about them in no uncertain terms, that I would be removed from these platforms. And then I wonder how many other people find themselves in this kind of conundrum where we have a sense or a feeling that something feels off about a lot of what we're experiencing right now. We can't put our finger on it, and we can't really have the discussions that are necessary to bring about clarity. And I think that seems to be one of the big challenges we're up against.
Well, I'm almost inarticulate if anybody doesn't see what's going on. I mean, we look to Canada, we've seen an atrocity. We look to Australia, it's worse. We look to Europe, we look to Germany, and they seem to be entering a lockstep of marching that looks like the onset of World War II. I mean, it's crazy. Okay, so to influence people, and without the First Amendment, it's not just the US that's screwed. The rest of the world is screwed because no other country has a robust First Amendment that protects everything else. If we can't say what we are meaning to say, and I mean, I'm no great courageous guy. I mean, I'm not working anymore. But in my age, I don't know what more important job I could have than try to expose some of this stuff. I mean, it's just there's nothing. Our feet are in the alligator's mouth, and I'm talking about these massive financial organizations. I'm talking about tech. I'm talking about big pharma. I'm talking about our wretched federal government.
Yeah. And sometimes the term grifter or grift gets thrown around, and I don't. The term is quite new to me, but my understanding of it is that those who would sort of seek to capitalize on holding a controversial opinion. But imagine if you've had your own medical practice for a number of years, that there is really very little financial incentive for you to adopt this position and have these conversations. And I wonder if you've actually seen the opposite of that, where there's actually some cost associated with you going in and entering into these conversations and holding these positions.
Well, I don't know what you can do except for march forward. And it's easy to get discouraged, but we cannot be discouraged because discouragement never won a battle. And so I mean, your question almost has no meaning for me because I have no more important. I could lose everything else and I'd still speak out.
Right. Okay. And so then really, what is your incentive for doing this? You're 68 years old, if I understand correctly, and I believe you're probably in good health and fairly robust health, all things considered, relative to the population in that age bracket. But really, what motivates you to get out of bed and to go and speak about these things?
John, once more, when your feet are in the alligator's mouth, what do you have to do? I mean, it's rhetorical, but I already answered that question. Let's move on to something else. I'm going to tell a story about the sales influence that the corporations use, the pharmaceutical companies use to sell their drugs. And see what you think of this. Their drug reps are taught the 3 F's of sales: food, flattery, and friendship. Sometimes they use the 4th F.
Fear?
No, 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 no.
Food, flattery, friendship, and...
They're women, some of them.
Oh, okay.
Okay, that's enough.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
So that's a little lighter. We got out of the heavier stuff. Ask away. Tell me what more you want.
Okay, so your book is Butchered by Healthcare, or one of your books. The other one is Hormone Secrets. And I think there's a couple of interesting things here that I wouldn't mind sort of diving into. Whenever we start using terminology like secrets, I mean, that from a marketing standpoint, that's a fairly solid term to use, because there's something within the human psyche where we're intrigued by, there's a piece of information that's either been suppressed or really not been talked about or undiscovered. Hormones themselves, while I think they're really beneficial, there's obviously an eventual upper limit. But are you suggesting that maybe what is being presented as the upper safe limit for the use of these hormones is much lower than what can be, and because of that, because I do believe that we're having some sort of, if I can put it this way, endocrinological, I don't know, a crisis of endocrinology. How about that? Where, for example, in men, we're seeing dramatically lower testosterone levels, and sometimes that's being perceived as a good thing, because I believe that testosterone is unfairly painted in this light of being responsible for men's less than ideal behavior. But really, I actually would point to maybe actually a lack of testosterone being the driver of these sorts of things. But so if we dive into that aspect of it, sort of the hormone secrets, what angle are you coming at this with, and what are you trying to put forward?
Well, yeah, that's true. Both sperm count and testosterone levels are dropping. And your second idea is also true, that for the most part, having a higher testosterone level gives men much more confidence, makes them perform better, makes them die later, right? And there's so many benefits to these things. I mean, I'll read a couple of testimonials about hormones, if you don't mind.
Mm-hmm.
So Stephen was an 82-year-old retired CEO of a major media company. He said, I had lost all strength and I was sitting in a wheelchair in a Palm Springs nursing home. The staff had to lift me in and out of bed. I was inches from being snuffed out. Then my doctor started coming in every week and giving me testosterone shots. In 6 weeks, I stood up and walked out of there back into my life. And so for women, I mean, here's an easier one. I could live without my husband, children, or cats, but I could never live without my beloved estrogen. Now, you're right. For whatever reason, hormone levels are dropping across the board, but we can supplement them. And we certainly, the most common mistake in hormone supplementation is giving too little rather than giving too much. In fact, it's hard to give too much. And as for something like thyroid, if you give too much, you're going to have symptoms, and the patients aren't going to take it. Mm-hmm. They'll have palpitations and cardiac goes faster. Yeah. So, I mean, these drugs estrogen in particular was downplayed or slandered or whatever by a study called the Women's Health Initiative that was published around 2003. And this thing scared the pants off of everyone because it claimed that estrogen caused cancer, when in fact that isn't even what the study showed. It showed that a progesterone analog or a chemical progesterone caused this minuscule increase in breast cancer. And so for up until now, I mean, the doctors are hesitant to prescribe this. They're afraid of lawsuits. They're afraid to get in trouble somehow. Mm-hmm. They're afraid of medical board sanctions by some ignorant idiot. And many of them won't even prescribe these hormones. So it's not so much a problem of using doses that are too small, or even really using these proprietary drugs that aren't even bioidentical hormones, like pregnant mare's urine estrogen, Premarin, right? Or Provera, which is a synthetic progesterone. The problem is that the doctors won't prescribe them at all. And
because they're scared of litigation.
They're scared of everything. I mean, I don't blame them. I mean, I felt the same way, but I was in a private practice situation where I wasn't as beholden to the organizations. I was in cosmetic surgery, mm-hmm. and my patients paid me, and I felt like I had good relationships with them, and I wanted to help them. So I didn't universally do cosmetic surgery for the people with menopausal symptoms. I offered them hormones, and I offered them If they consented and they understood the whole story, I offered them an implantable hormone pill that would work for 3 months. And typically they would come back just dancing, and it wasn't the breast aug that did it. I mean, they just feel so much better.
Right. So, and then in the case of men and testosterone, so, because I remember having this conversation with a doctor of mine, and I mean, I've been involved in the supplement and bodybuilding industry where it's like a horribly kept secret. It's not really a secret at all that, of course, these individuals choose to use supraphysiologic doses of various testosterone analogs.
They start out at 10 cc's of cypionate a week,
yeah,
which is 10 times what a physiologic dose is. So that's a lot of testosterone. But you're going to tell me the secret. I'm going to tell you the poorly kept secret. It's not very risky. It's perfectly safe. Get a few pimples, you know?
Because so I'd be interested in your take on this, because I recall having this conversation with my doctor, because I have clients coming to me saying, this is what I'm using. And I mean, I'm a nutritionist by trade, not a medical professional. It's good for me to be informed about like what my clients are doing, because it would help me in that regard, just to at least make informed decisions and recommendations. However, of course, I couldn't, from a medical standpoint, make any sort of suggestions on what they should do. But my doctor said, okay, the thing to consider with testosterone, the concern is the risk of, I think they'll talk about the risk of clotting, the risk of sort of cardiovascular conditions.
Hey, that's one of those black box warnings, and it's completely fraudulent. It's without qualification, it's fraudulent. Now, I don't know, John, whether I've sent you ways to download my books, but you're welcome to have them. I'll get them.
I believe you have. So I'll make sure I put them on a reading list.
Download the hormone book and read that, and click through the references if you don't believe me. I mean, there are these massive studies that have been done that basically said the black box warning on testosterone is total nonsense. I'd use a stronger word, but I think this is a family
we try to keep this PG as much as possible.
PG.
Right. So then, is there? I mean, I hesitate to use the word in a sense, but I'm like, is there some sort of conspiracy around testosterone where men with lower levels of testosterone are easier to manage or control, or something like that?
No, I don't think that's the case. But there is there is a huge incentive, let's put it that way, for the drug companies to conspire with the FDA. See, the FDA, 50% of their revenue comes directly from pharmaceutical companies during the patent application process. So what that means is the FDA is entirely a creature of big pharma. It might as well just be part of their marketing department. So anything you've read about the current situation and had a reference to the FDA or the World Health Organization or any of these 3-letter organizations, I'd like to say 4-letter, but any of these organizations, they're completely corrupted by the big money. And this drug that is being foisted on us, it's not the most profitable drug in history. It's probably the most profitable product in history, because all of the marketing is being done by the governments. I mean, it's just crazy. It might be $100 billion in 1 year in one company.
Right. And it's hard for people to look at that and not suggest that something might be corrupt here. And you're right. It would be hard to look at this fact that the FDA is being funded entirely by big pharma. It's the foxes guarding.
But 50% might as well be all.
Right, because there's a lot of government bureaucrats who lose the reason to exist if they let's say fail to, like, if a pharmaceutical company, because look, pharmaceutical research is expensive and costly to run the actual sort of gold standard clinical trials, and so.
Well, but they spend a lot more marketing than on the trials. The marketing is their big expense.
Which kind of points to a bit of a problem here when you're spending more money in marketing than you are on the clinical research, and you're doing, I guess you would do the bare minimum of clinical research in order to sort of satisfy some sort of regulatory body. And so then your other book, which is Butchered by Healthcare, so we have the hormone side of things, then you have Butchered by Healthcare. And I mean, that's obviously this very evocative language to use. And you yourself are a former surgeon who's obviously carried out surgical procedures on probably countless, thousands of individuals anyways. Butchered by Healthcare, what are we really talking about? And what are you meaning when you say that?
Well, the whole thing is, it's a mess from start to finish. And I gave examples. I told you about psychiatry. Let me go off on another very obvious example. We've done oncology, which is cancer therapy. And these guys, they have about 5 or 6 diseases they can treat adequately. The rest of it, their published goals are to increase lifespan by 2 months per disease. And in exchange for this, you give them drugs that make them sick as hell. and they cost $100,000 on average a year. So the thing about the oncologists is that they get kickbacks for every single drug they administer in their office, 20% off the top of the drug. And this would be illegal if you and I, John, were physicians and you told me, here, Bob, sell this drug for me. I'll give you 20% off the top. That's called capping in the United States. It's a felony. You go to jail. But for between these companies and the doctors, it's perfectly legal. And so, I mean, it's not just the oncologists. A lot of the other doctors who treat an occasional cancer give an injection of an anti-testosterone drug or something might cost $10,000. Cost them, they get $2,000 for giving it. Takes them 30 seconds. So
easy,
I mean,
ridiculously easy money.
It's ridiculously easy money, and this gets worse. They get paid by the milligram. So these guys get called up by the drug reps, and they say, "Look, you're at 2,300 milligrams for the month. You get up to 28, we'll give you a 10% spiff." So I mean, it's just crazy,
right? And so these are fairly. I'm not sure if this is
using. They make a lot of money.
Right. So these are pretty inflammatory claims to make. And is this publicly documented?
Oh, John, I never say anything that isn't derivative. These are all carefully documented. There's not. Right. I mean, my source for that claim is, I believe, it's Otis Brawley's book called "How We Do Harm." I believe it came from there. I'm not 100% sure, but anybody that wants to challenge me, pick up a $3 ebook copy of either one of my books. And then word search in that thing for, chemotherapy, and you can find my references very easily. And they're not controversial. I mean, it's just like you can probably find that in Wikipedia. I mean, I don't know for sure, but they try to purge everything they can out of Wikipedia is under constant attack by industry shills and ghostwriters and all kinds of people. So.
So you're shining a light through the work that you're doing now, the advocacy that you're doing now. You're shining a light on some major industry problems that exist. Now, in your mind, are there some solutions that are potentially available that people could, I mean, like, because in my line of work, my goal is to kind of help people as much as possible take their health into their own hands and take responsibility for
That's
it.
Good.
Because we could say there's an element of society that's essentially hanging around waiting for a diagnosis and living a really poor quality of life. And it's to try to, and I want to try to incentivize people that, if you want to live a life worth living, it's going to take some work. Do you have also some solutions that you offer people?
Good question. So before I answer that, why don't you tell me what percent of what I'm saying is perfectly novel and new to you, and what percent you suspected or you sort of thought about or you had some pre-knowledge of?
I think 0% of this is novel to me.
Good. Okay, that is reassuring. Okay, so the answer is, how can people take their health into their own hands? Okay, so first of all, you've got to do your research, be as skeptical as you can. Pick up my ebooks for $3 a piece. I'm not a money-making operation. I sell about 30 books a day, but there's no net profit after the advertising. I pay Amazon ads. Okay, so the things that they can do, first of all, you have to understand. You have to adopt a sort of a psychology or a philosophy of healthcare. And you have to realize the doctors generally don't have a freaking magic wand. And if your aging is going to be part of your life, and you have to be sanguine about that whole thing. But if you have an unusual problem, there are some really good things you can do that weren't available 3 or 4 years ago. The first thing you can do is join the patient association groups. Now, these are sponsored by drug companies, but they're still exceedingly sincere people in these things. And you can start at smartpatients.com and just search for patient groups for different, and then put in your disease. And if you have something odd, there's a group that will help you. And there are people in that group who spend all their time trying to help other individuals who have the problem. They have husbands, or they have somebody who died in their family with the oddball cancer. So that's very helpful. The second thing you have, at least in America, is you can visit virtually almost anyone who will agree to see you for just a few $100s or a few $1,000s. You can get a consultation. And so, I mean, prior to 2 years ago, and I think Trump made an executive order that you could do this prior to about 2 years ago. It was against the rules to do that because in theory, in-person visits are better, right? Because the doctor can pick up on a lot of subtleties. But with the situation that was in place with the social distancing and the lockdowns and all that other stuff, Trump threw this on the table, and it turned out to have a lot of good effects for people who have big problems.
Because it could lead them to potentially being able to match up with somebody who might be better suited.
You can almost get any care at any town in America, but you sometimes need supervision from an academic center. They can get a hold of any kind of chemotherapy, but there are subtleties about the administration of medications that are not available except for the sharpest people in the room. And they are, I mean, I hate to admit this, but they're sometimes at the best known academic centers, many times.
Right. So maybe just the last thing to touch on here, because I appreciate your time and sharing this. The word cancer strikes fear into the hearts of most people who ever hear this. But I'm inclined to think, and I could have this wrong, so I'd be curious to know, it seems like the life expectancy of those who get a cancer diagnosis has improved over a number of years. It's, because I think there's some out there who shout, well, we're losing the war on cancer, but there's others who say, well, actually, if you look at the numbers, we're winning. What's your understanding of sort of where we stand?
So cancer is tremendously heterogeneous. It's a lot of different entities. And outside of about 5 different diseases, lymphomas and certain, testicular cancer, some other things, our cancer therapies have been an utter failure. Now, I can come down as flat-footed as I say that because that's how flat-footed my sources are. And, saying that you're going to live 2 years longer on average is like a bad joke. Now, all that said, if we practice medicine as the art it is, right, and you go to the right person, I mean, sometimes you can find someone that has seen 4 cases out of the 25 that have appeared in the United States, and they have a unique chemotherapy system that will cure you. And we sent one of my I'll say it was a friend's daughter to someone in Houston at MD Anderson, which is the most expensive possible place in the world, but it's also has the cancer expertise. And this guy came out of retirement to treat this little girl, and he cured her of a very oddball tumor that looked like the next step was to take her eye out because the thing was on her eyelid, right? They excited, and that didn't happen to her. She got married the other day. And so if the art of medicine is practiced properly, we wouldn't be doing spinal surgery on every young Hispanic work comp patient that came in the door who with some back pain. We would carefully watch them, and we would use more careful criteria. And if we weren't so motivated by these tremendous rewards of the chemotherapy, where the oncologist's dream is to get a room filled with Barca loungers, those are those reclining chairs with 20 patients in it 5 days a week, giving them drips, and they get 20% off the top of they're hooked into the big pharma main line of huge financial rewards.
Right.
And, okay. So the answer to your question is, I think there are some wonderful new things coming around. We have some monoclonal antibodies that do things that I'm not so aware of, but for the most part, cancer therapy is a failure with a few exceptions.
But there is some degree of hope.
There's hope. Yeah.
Right. And
you have to study your own subject. You have to study it yourself.
So what you might be suggesting then is despite all of the corruption that is taking place, somewhere amidst all of the corruption, there are still good people doing good things and even good pharmaceuticals.
Well, when you spend $1.3 trillion on big pharma, they're doing something or other. And they there are miracles. I don't want to be so negative about medicine that I don't want your listeners to think that I don't believe that there are miracles. There are miracles every day in medicine. I mean, we've got the most successful operation in history. That's probably the hip replacement surgery. That really works. That you get up and walk around within a couple of days. And we have a lot of things that are being done too much. The art of medicine isn't being used right. A third of our women, by the time they're 60, or maybe 40%, have had their uterus out. That's too many. A third of the women get cesarean sections instead of having a normal delivery, when the sweet spot for mortality or lifespan is about 15%. So there's a lot of nonsense that's going on that is it's completely out of control, and it's incentivized in a kind of a sick blend of capitalism and socialism. And I don't know if it's better in Canada or not, but I mean, I've heard a lot of negative stories out of Canada.
Yeah. So then, what in your mind, is there a solution? Because you struggle with the for-profit sickness model, but it's an industry that's it's grown into this monster, this behemoth that seems like it's impossible to even tackle. Is there any sort of, I don't know whether it's a political solution or a private sector solution, or how can this potentially be rectified?
Right. You got to realize what you're up against. And when the medical sector is $4 trillion, that's 20% of the gross domestic product. That's the biggest industry in America. That means that in America, where you're allowed to bribe your congresspeople and your senators and the president with donations, there's no way to get around these people. And they have essentially entirely purchased our legislature and the executive branch. Now, it's, I mean, it's, and we've got a country where 2 tech companies, right? The whole U.S. federal thing is, they get $3.5 trillion in tax revenues, and of course they're spending more than that, but they're about the same size as healthcare. And so, I mean, healthcare, particularly pharma, can buy these people off without any trouble at all. I mean, we got a situation where 2 tech companies must have a $5 trillion market cap. That's Apple and Google, right? So they're bigger. They have a bigger market cap than our federal revenues plus whatever they spend extra. I mean, it's a wild situation, and basically the consensus of the people that have looked at this, and so I gotta, you gotta say, very idealistic people tried to put Obamacare together, but when they looked at it, they realized that there was nothing the lobbyists would agree to, unless it was to make the pie bigger for their clients, the companies. So, I mean, I don't have any great hope for this thing, except for there's a great crisis developing. And I don't know, we'll have to all be real poor, and then there won't be anything left for the big companies. But, in a sea where we're tossed about by these waves, and I mean, I somehow think these people are going to have a bigger boat.
Yeah. Well, just to close out, then, if you were to just maybe share some words of wisdom, someone who might have been listening to this, who might feel a little bit discouraged or disheartened because the situation that we find ourselves in, what's something that gives you a degree of hope that makes you, because obviously if you keep doing this advocacy work that you're doing, you obviously see there's some hope here, that there's a purpose and a meaning to it, and it's worth fighting for.
Well, those are a bunch of different ideas, and I would say that Eisenhower said it best, and what he said was that optimism or pessimism was no way to win a battle or a war, right? And so we have to push forward, and if we can preserve our First Amendment rights, the whole thing rests on that, right? And so once we're able to talk about issues openly and honestly, the liars and the propagandists and the rip-off artists and the rent seekers can't stand before us. And the world has to watch our battle from the sidelines, because it seems to us like Canada's already lost. And if we come around, maybe there's hope for you, John. I mean, I'm so sad about what's happened in Canada.
Well, we'll do what we can, and I agree. It's these are the kinds of conversations that mean, like, we still have the freedom to have these, and so there's people out there that are trying to be a voice of truth and reason in amidst all of the corruption that takes place. So I do appreciate you taking the time to indulge me in the questions that I have, and appreciate you being a part of the conversation.
Let me just give you my platforms. You can find either of my books on Amazon. I have a Substack, which seems to be a platform that's uncensored now, and that's Robert Yoho, RobertYoho.substack.com, and that's a path into my podcasts and so on. And I have a website, robertyohoauthor.com, that you can look at more information about my 2 books.
And all of those links will be included in the show notes for those who are listening after the fact as well. So thank you again for being part of the conversation. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much, John.
We've created a foundation of basing who we are on the response we get from people. People are expressing to somebody else out of the dislike maybe for themselves. When you can respond with compassion, you know you've learned to develop a certain amount of love and respect and appreciation for yourself.
Compassion allows us to look at these things and to see them as they are, with a desire to understand without the need to judge. And in that space, that's where we create powerful transformational change.